Good evening. You can see we have some participants filtering in. My name is Jennifer Tafe. I am the director of the Museum of American Bird Art, or MABA, at Mass Audubon. And I'd like to thank you for joining us for tonight's lecture. Tonight is the third in our free fall online lecture series, The Art of Birds. And with this series, we hope to broaden our ideas about birds in art and who is telling these stories and how. After tonight, we have three more very exciting lectures in the series this fall, each featuring an accomplished scholar or creator or artist or expert. And we really hope you'll join us for all of those, all of our remaining lectures by registering for free on our website at massaudubon.org/MABA, M-A-B-A. And for those of you who are somewhat new to our museum's community, I really encourage you to visit our website and learn more about all of the exciting programs we offer and to learn more about the new museum building we are planning in Concord, Massachusetts. And I'd like to thank our supporters and remind our audience that it is people like you who make these amazing programs possible. So please consider making a gift to our museum. I'd like to extend a special thanks to AJ on our IT staff for making this series happen, for all of his support. And we also welcome your questions and encourage your questions. So please enter those into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to those at the close of the lecture. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker and my new colleague, Eulogio Guzmán. Tonight, Professor Guzmán will share his fascinating research with us on the topic of 16th century feather mosaics and their role as political negotiators. These objects are truly resplendent, and I can't wait for Professor Guzmán to share his knowledge and expertise with us. Professor Guzmán's work examines the socio-political value of visual culture in pre-Columbian and colonial societies within the Americas, and he is a specialist in the visual manifestation of indigenous governance and political sovereignty of Middle American civilizations. He has many publications to his name, including a co-edited volume that examines the political significance of space in many capitals across the world. And he is currently completing a book on the ways the Mexican Empire used art and architecture to promote its power and control over a blend of different political groups. We are so excited to have him with us tonight. Please welcome Professor Guzmán.
Thank you very much. I first of all would like to thank the Massachusetts Audubon Society and especially Jennifer Tafe for extending this wonderful invitation to come present on my academic work and present this talk, which I have entitled, and there we go, Splendorous Messaging, Political Negotiation in the Material Exchange in the New World. I am going to go ahead and start with a small little quick overview of what we're going to be looking at. I will start with this first focusing on the established narratives that is related to discovery, conquest, and gift exchange, which really kind of frame the larger questions that I'm engaging with, and that is, examining indigenous dominion by the Mexica/Aztec Empire. X's are pronounced as SH's. So they're the Mexica. Commonly, all of you know them as the Aztec Empire, and then focusing on essentially their kind of imperial messaging prior to contact. First, focusing on the Temple Mayor offerings. I'll explain what the Temple Mayor is. It's their most important civic religious building. And then also the monumental sculpture program, to be very, very fast, flash before the screen, so to speak, to then really kind of get to the other section, very important middle section of the talk, which is to deal with the points of contact between the Mexica and the Habsburg Empire, which actually supervised the conquest of the Americas. And there's a very interesting point of intersection there. To then talk about gift exchange and essentially also the reception of these gifts to Europe, to then end up wrapping things, pivoting to the colonial period, the early 1600s, and seeing the transformation, which is actually what you're seeing here in this last image, the transformation of essentially now new imagery being created to then fully understand what I'm talking about here, referring to as Splendorous messaging. So let's begin. Of course, in trying to understand and giving larger context to this point of exchange, one needs to look at the established narratives, which are and can be distorting, right? There is this idea of the grand narrative related to conquest of by even all the way back to Romans, right? I came, I saw, I conquered, Julius Caesar's famous narrative, which is, of course, co-opted by the Spanish, and it's used to basically extend from all the way from the beginning, even with Columbus. Though, of course, he's not on any, conquest tour, but the ideas of essentially the meeting of worlds and these different exchanges, in which, of course, the indigenous people always are not anywhere near as, having any agency. That is to say, there in the number of exchanges, there is always very, very clearly greater engagement that has taken place. And that's what we're seeing here in these images. But to pivot, to look at the pre-Hispanic world. So one of the quick things that I wanted to give you was just an overview of what is known as the Aztec Empire, the Mexica Empire. And so it was a vast empire centered out of modern day Mexico City. Back then, their capital was named Mexico Tenochtitlan. And as you can see, this illustration at the bottom shows you this vast overview of the entire empire. The capital, or not empire, excuse me, the capital of the empire, which sat in the middle of this glassy lake in the center of Lake Texcoco. And as you can see here, the city was actually divided. It was this big giant island that was then divided into quarters. And at the center of that island, there was a ceremonial precinct. And at the center of the ceremonial precinct was this majestic building, which is called the Templo Mayor, or the major temple, the principal temple. As you can see here, stacked rectangular platforms that reached a flat summit, which was capped with two shrines. And the shrines were dedicated to two gods, two principal gods. One, the god of rain, named Tlaloc. The other, a god of war, whose name is Huitzilopochtli, or hummingbird, on the south or on the left. So hence the T and the H is making a reference precisely to the placement of those two shrines, just for the purposes of these various different illustrations that I'm about to show you. The actual Templo Mayor, you can see here in its planimetric view, right, with various different sections in blue. It's actually making a reference to various stages of construction. That is to say, the building was completely finished multiple times. And that's what you're seeing in this illustration on the left-hand side. It is essentially just giving you a view of what essentially was this continuous building and rebuilding of the structure, built over a large period of time, close to 100 years. And the building sequencing has been identified by archaeologists, Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, who was the person who first drove the discussion, the uncovering of this magnificent building, which you can, in fact, visit today in Mexico City. And you can see the stages of construction here, slightly in different color hues of blue. And that's what you're seeing in terms of the layering with these red numbers, and they tie specifically to various different Aztec emperors. The idea is that this was essentially the center of all activity. It was the nexus of essentially all ritual, of all economic activity. And so therefore, it's not at all surprising that there was a great amount of imperial messaging. So there's two sections here, one focusing specifically on semi-private messaging. That's what you're seeing here. Here's yet again that outline of essentially the Templo Mayor, which you saw in the previous slide. Let me just return to it so that way you can just see. So this essentially is making a reference to this footprint. And what you're seeing here, the red dots or the red triangles, are making a reference to the slew of offerings which were deposited, which were these ritual objects that were curated. There were essentially these semi-private exhibitions, temporary exhibitions that lasted a few days before they were capped, and then they would build over. And so you can see here the vast number of the vast number of offerings that have been made to up until today, archaeologists, especially under the direction of both Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, but also the current director of the project, which is Leonardo Lopez Dujan, who supervised these magnificent excavations. Over 200 offerings have been found with over 500,000 objects. This image on the right-hand side gives you an idea of essentially different layers, different tiers of essentially deposits in one single area. And what you see on the right-hand side is a photograph of Diana Wagner, this archaeologist who's actually excavating the offering. You can see one of these figures that has actually this sculpture, this portable sculpture, which is here from offering 11. So there are quite a number of these various different offerings, as I mentioned, and every one of them is unique, and every one of them has these various different vast kind of imperial messages that are being presented. And the messages, have everything to do with essentially the ways in which they're referencing this encyclopedic view of the empire, materially speaking. And in this particular case, dealing with bestiary, so these animals specifically, and there are a wide variety of offerings that have animals. And in fact, the illustration that you see on the left-hand side shows you 3 different references to offerings. You can see them clustered here. You can see some scattered over here. Every one of these shows different. And you can see in this particular case, this offering, as it tells you, this has pumas and jaguars. This image, this one here has wolves. And this one on the bottom is particularly interesting to us, of course, because it has eagles and then also a hawk, as well as then other kinds of birds. You can see in this illustration from offering 125 in this exploded view, where in fact two eagles were actually were placed over precisely this offering of a wolf. We'll get to that in a little bit later, but essentially these offerings are making a reference to the gift and tribute that's actually feeding, that's being brought, that's actually part of the growth of empire. And so what I'm showing you here is the diversity of objects that are found. Here's yet a different offering that is showing you essentially the compact nature of these objects when they are being presented and the various different kinds of materials that are found within it. So you can see this marine kind of reference to then this wolf, which is dressed, by the way. It has this fantastic jewelry on it, as you can see, some ear spools there and some gold over here, as well as cultural items that make references to previous cultures that predated the Mexica, some by over 1,000 years. The Mexica were in fact interested in excavating the past and owning different parts of essentially this wonderful kind of past. And so here are multiple references, and the principal reason why I'm showing you this is to precisely end up emphasizing the material vastness of this empire, which they called Sem Anahuac, one bound by water, one bound by ocean or by the water. So you can see why is that? Because you have, these sort of parentheses of essentially the Gulf of Mexico and then the Pacific Ocean. Very analogous to from sea to shining sea. What is really fascinating is then pivoting from that very kind of semi-private to the more public, these monumental messages, and that the Mexica are particularly known for. And among them, you can see this at the very, very bottom of the stairs here, leading up to the summit precisely, where you would find this disc of this goddess. And here you can see precisely the actual scale of this monument in relationship to this archaeologist who's cleaning her up, dolling her up, and then other monuments, which really talk about this sort of incredible bestiary, these really spectacular spectacular beings in relationship to these other small portable sculptures that you saw certainly in one of the previous sculptures, one of the previous images before. So now pivoting to this point of contact, right? So all that I've shown you is pre-contact, that is to say, pre-arrival of the Spanish. But with the arrival of the Spanish, which is what we see here in this cover to the 12th book of this magnificent ethnographic compendium, which is called the Florentine Codex. And it is a book that has this long history. It is a book that is supervised by a Franciscan friar by the name of Bernardino de Sahagún, and he supervises indigenous tlacuilos, which are basically artists, painters. To write was to paint was to write in the indigenous world. And so they are primarily engaged in illustrating, but then also kind of writing some of the text. And what's interesting is the text actually is presented in two different columns, as you can see here in this book that's being opened. On the left, there's always the Spanish, while on the right, there is a Nahuatl text, which is the language, the indigenous language that the Mexica spoke. And interspersed always on the left are going to be these images. And that's what we're seeing here. You can see the first image, interestingly enough, and essentially the title to the 12th book says, in Spanish, el doceno libro que trata de cómo los españoles conquistaron a la Ciudad de México, which translates to the 12th book, which deals with how the Spaniards conquered the city of Mexico. And so what you see is precisely the disembarkment on the Gulf Coast of the Spanish. And you can see in this image here to the right, you see a woman who is standing there, a woman known by the name of Marina or Malinche, Malintzin, and sitting next to her is supposedly Cortez writing. If you follow this trajectory, you then arrive at seeing now in the very next page, the Spaniards galloping what one can only assume towards Mexico City, towards the capital. What's interesting is that history actually, and what we now know in terms of these various different events and the sequencing, of course, in relationship to this grand narrative of I came, I saw, I conquered, there is very quickly, references to the great acts of conquest on behalf of the Spaniards. However, there is a very interesting event that takes place that I am very, very much focusing a lot of my present work around, and that is what happens actually prior to the arrival of Cortez. And as you can see here, Cortez is the last of these explorations. In this wonderful map, you can see there are 3 different expeditions that are being shown. And you can see 2 prior ones being done both by Francisco Hernandez de Córdoba, who is the first person to actually explore. He doesn't land on any of the mainland except on Florida, okay? Then he is followed the next year by Juan de Grijalva, who you can see actually doesn't land in both the Yucatan Peninsula and then eventually at Zempoala, where he goes ahead and he has a gift exchange with the Lord of Zempoala, who sends these objects that he exchanges, glass beads, to his overlord, the Emperor Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, who is the person you all know as Montezuma. Montezuma, when he receives these objects, he is absolutely, sort of taken by them, so much so that he immediately enters into production of this spectacular lavish gift, which he ends up sending. And the gift is actually ready for Cortez when he arrives. And this is a fascinating thing. As I mentioned to you before, the first page of book 12 shows you the arrival of Spanish. The next page shows you the actual, moving towards, now on land, towards the capital. What's interesting is 7 pages later, we actually get this magnificent illustration, which you see here on page, on 6 verso, which again, here's your Spanish column, here is the Nahuatl translation or the Nahuatl text, and the 2 illustrations that appear on the left-hand side have gone ahead and basically enlarged it here on the right so you can see. It shows you Cortez sitting in this X chair. You only see the top portion of the X chair, which is the chair that was usually sat on by high-ranking elites. You can see he is actually incredibly moved. He pushes back. Alessandra Russo has analyzed this image, and she has talked about how Cortez's awe was such when he saw these objects. You can see his hand is pulled to the chest while the other one is almost like holding onto the chair. because of the gifts that are being brought to him. And what's really quite remarkable, you can see where these gifts are actually being offered on the water. The Aztec emissaries came and boarded his boat. That is to say, before he got off, before the first scene that is presented in this frontispiece, we actually have this event and it's recorded. And what's so magnificent about this is that we're told Cortez actually writes a long description of the objects that he received, because he took all of these objects and sent them back to Europe. I'll talk about this in just a second. And this is part of a much larger, very complicated series of events that he is engaged in. And this is what I'm actually unpacking. But so just quickly, for the purposes of this presentation, we actually do have many objects that have survived that are actually in Vienna, in the Welt Museum, which houses some of the collections of the Habsburgs. We know that Charles V, who is seated here, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was Charles I, King of Spain, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, received these objects in Spain just as he was about to leave to go to the royal palace. So these objects, Cortes ended up sending him to gain favor with his emperor, because he wanted to essentially have a better political positioning for himself and his claims of grandeur. And of course, Charles V was more than delighted to receive these objects. He was very, very, very taken by them. As you can see, they're pretty spectacular. It's especially taken by, these feather mosaics, which you see here, the spectacular shield, which is a war shield, but it's quite symbolic, of course, finished in feathers, of a roseate spoonbill along with hummingbird feathers. And you can see the importance of feathers in indigenous society in the fact that feathers are actually defined or bound by gold. That is to say, gold is the setting for feathers. So they had more of a predilection, more of an interest for feather work than they did actually in terms of material presence than gold. You see these objects in the bottom here that are gold. And I'm just going to move on so that we then are able to see the other part of this gift exchange. It goes to Charles V. As I mentioned, he receives it in Spain. He takes all of these objects back to the Keuterberg Palace. Before he gets to the Keuterberg Palace, he decides to pay a visit to his uncle, Henry VIII, who's married, of course, his aunt, Catherine of Aragon. So from there, he goes to the royal palace, presents the objects to his aunt, who is the overseer of the royal palace. She immediately, and her name is Margaret of Austria, she immediately sees the value, the political value in this, and decides, and this is quite spectacular, that she is going to hold an exhibition of these objects in 1520, because these objects have been sent, arrive in Spain in October of 1519. They arrive in the palace at Keuterberg Palace in 1520, and she decides she's going to hold an exhibition of these objects so that therefore all of the high-ranking elites can come and see this. And who should come but no other than Albrecht Dürer, who was part of the court. And he, in his sketchbook, writes this wonderful quote, which is very, very famous. And I've gone ahead and just highlighted several key points in here. So I will read this just very quickly. And so you can see, I saw the things which have been brought to the king from the new land of gold, Mexico, a sun of all gold, a whole fathom broad, and a moon of all of silver of the same size. Also 2 rooms full of the armor of the people there, and all manner of wondrous weapons of theirs, harness and darts, very strange clothing, beds, and all kinds of wonderful objects of human use, much better worth seeing than prodigies. These things were all so precious that they are valued at over 100,000 florins. All the days of my life, I've seen nothing that rejoiced my heart so such as these things, for I saw amongst them wonderful works of art, and I marveled at the subtle ingenia of men in foreign lands. Indeed, I cannot express all that I thought. He really genuinely was impressed by these objects. Karina Johnson has a wonderful, colleague historian, has done marvelous work examining precisely at least 3 different descriptions that Albrecht Dürer actually writes about three very important moments in his life. One is seeing the new cathedral of Nuremberg once it's finished, and the second is seeing the wonderful coronation um, of Charles V. He uses very similar analogous language to make these points. So what is especially interesting here for me is the idea and the reference to the wondrous weapons and the armor of the people there. I think these objects, which were sent, specifically this shield, was a message of war, was a splendorous war message about the resplendence of essentially the warriors. You can see here this wonderful illustration in the Codex Eulogio, which is done post-conquest, in which we see the Prince Nezahualcóyotl dressed in this wonderful iridescent, plumed kind of getup, which of course he was using this symbolically. There was no way he was going into battle dressed with this, or even with any of these magnificent shields, right? It's no more different than the way in which we see the armor in Europe, and where we see paintings such as this painting by Titian of Charles V on horseback as he has just defeated, the Protestants in the Battle of Mulberg, and this wonderful shield that is made by by many different artists in his court. We have, and we can, in fact, you could go to visit this very spectacular armor that he's wearing, which he probably only wore for a matter of minutes, or if not, maybe 30 minutes. And in fact, this whole scene is recreated in the Armory Palace in the Almeria Palace in Madrid. The point is that these were messages that really were actually interludes towards greater negotiations, and also kind of, calling people into the sort of exchange and warfare. What is particularly fascinating about these objects is they also emphasize the idea of a composite, of objects being made of tiny thousands of little objects. And what you see here are precisely these various different plumes, of course, of a roseate spoonbill, but then also of this broad-billed hummingbird that make up essentially this wonderful object. So in that way, it is yet another way in composing these objects. They're quite literally being composed of the many different subjects, which in this case includes all of the animalia under the domain of the Mexica. So it's interesting to then think in terms of these as surrogate encounters, because regretfully, even though it was very clear to me, and that's what I'm trying to argue in this book that I'm working on now, that essentially this exchange was one in which these objects acted as surrogates for Montezuma in sending such a lavish gift, a gift that wasn't intended for Cortés. The fact that this gift would have completely just as you can see there, impressed Cortés, was meant really for Cortés's premier, that is to say, Charles. Montezuma didn't know he existed. But in sending such a magnificent message, it was clearly sent to the person who was the most highest rank. And Cortés turned it around and sent it, but of course, now making a reference to himself to gain favor with the emperor. So what you see here is essentially the holdings of the Habsburg Empire at that point, the Koudenberg Palace being in the Netherlands, just up here. And so it's the idea of these various different objects working as material exchanges as part of this larger network. So now, regretfully, that doesn't go as planned. Montezuma does not have the larger audience, the larger negotiation, probably, which would have brought a different exchange. Sadly, it's a miscalculation, it's a misplay. Nevertheless, one has to acknowledge the fact that this Mexica emperor is trying to negotiate a more favorable political negotiation for himself based on the patterns of the many different objects and offerings which he had secured, and the very many different successful campaigns, which are reflected in the richness of the deposits that have been excavated in Mexico. So moving now towards conquest, post defeat of the Mexica. Sadly, Cortez ends up leveling the city. Okay. He creates a drawing or supervises when he goes back to Nuremberg. You'll see this in a few images coming up. The map that he supervises gets made in 1524, which accompanies essentially his description of the Aztec capital. It is sad that the actual capital is razed to the ground. There's a variety of different complex issues related to it. It's razed by the ground, not only by the Spanish, but largely by an indigenous rebellion, which is led by, or it's complemented by, Cortez. The big benefactors, of course, end up being the Spaniards. But make no mistake about it, it was an indigenous rebellion in which many of the enemies to the Mexica were more than interested in toppling this vast empire that governed over them for many years before the arrival of the Spanish. Quickly, the Spanish end up bringing in a wide variety, and especially Cortez, to emphasize the idea of the benevolence of their essentially enterprise, this just war, which is defeating these pagan idol worshippers. He ends up requesting for friars, and specifically Franciscan friars, to come. Initially, there are 3 Franciscan friars who arrive to Mexico a couple of years immediately after conquest, 1524. And they are Juan de Ahora, Juan de Tecto, and the third is this mendicant Pedro de Gante, who is actually painted here in this painting from the 18th century, which he becomes known as the protectorate of the indigenous people. As you can see, this indigenous boy who is sitting here underneath one of his studies. He is the only survivor of those 3 first Franciscan arrivals. The other 2, Juan de Tecto and Juan de Ahora, die within a year of actually having arrived into Mexico. Pedro de Gante immediately decides that what he needs to do is to actually build a church, supervise the building of a church for indigenous people. And that's what you're seeing here on the left-hand side. This is the first church that gets built. That's called an open chapel. It's an indigenous kind of, well, we don't actually know exactly who invented the type, but this is eventually what will lead to essentially Borromini's arms in the Vatican and, the open masses that are now a staple of Catholic religion. The first place that was practiced was here in Mexico. And what you see is an altar open precisely to a very large courtyard. This was what essentially where mass would be held out towards indigenous people who were standing out here, because that allowed for large congregations of 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 masses at once by one friar. It is also there in this church, which is called San José de los Naturales, after Saint Joseph. Of course, the indigenous people are called naturales, natural people from this place. It is there that in the adjacent spaces, there are schools. There's one particular school that gets created precisely to educate the upper elite, and it is an art school where the friars, in this case, you can see this is supposed to be Bernardino Sahagún, is actually supervising indigenous people learning now European styles, European art. However, here's the most fascinating thing. Pedro de Gante and all of these Franciscan friars encourage indigenous people to continue practicing their indigenous arts. And that's what you're seeing in these illustrations to the right, which are presented in the Florentine Codex. And what's really quite remarkable, Diana Magaloni has done magnificent work in which she has really wanted to look at essentially the artists who were actually creating these illustrations. And what she has been able to discover is that the artists who are actually rendered here are being biographical. These are the artists who are both painting these objects, but also were engaged in other processes. And here you can see they are engaged in the process of feather making, feather mosaics. Okay, so here's the most amazing, remarkable thing. So here you can see little birds, little hummingbirds, right? And the various different plumes that they had taken from them. In preparing the different feathers, they would cut them, they would end up shaping them, they would dye them sometimes, to then be able to do these magnificent objects that we now are going to finish this talk with. Here's a collection of these spectacular objects. What you see across the bottom are all bishops' mitres, okay, in which they show scenes precisely of crucifixion of Christ. It's really quite stunning that you can see just the level of mastery that these indigenous artists have in these very intricate small scenes, which they show you precisely this tree of Jesse being presented. And you can see they are from various different collections. Bishop mitre from El Escorial, which is what you see here. These two are actually in Florence. They are given to the Medici as gifts by Cortez and by several other, also Habsburgs. Then this one in Lyon, France. And then on the top, you see these various different images, which are just quite spectacular, as you can see. And these are all objects. I will focus on, especially on this image on the left-hand side in just a minute, but I'll show you some details so you can get a little bit more of a sense as to how these objects were created. These are actually, they cut the feathers, they prepare the feathers, they actually use pitch, glue, and also what they do is they stitch this magnificent sort of backing so that then therefore all of these objects are placed in. And you can see this wonderful image on the right-hand side showing St. Michael slaying the demon here, the devil here, also dated, and we think possibly from the same artist as these two images, which were in the Kunstkammer to the collections of King Rudolph. So as I just very quickly move through here, you can see a detail of Mary. You can see that this image is actually based on a print. Pretty spectacular. But now I'm going to pivot to this magnificent representation of this scene, which is very, very famous, very well known. You can see this print comes from actually the Netherlands. It is done in 1490 through 1500. It is then brought to Mexico. Indigenous artists see it, and they create this magnificent image on the right-hand side, which we know is made by 1539 because the date is actually presented up here at the top. What is interesting is it's a pretty faithful rendition, except there is one major change. And I'm just going to move quickly through this. And that is that you can see the architecture on the image on the left-hand side makes a reference to precisely areas in northern Europe. That is actually removed by the artist, and he places this magnificent backdrop of hummingbird feathers, right? This blue, this spectacular blue. But what's interesting is he uses this also to now add two elements that will end up making a reference to specifically the place where this scene is taking place. This miraculous apparition, right, which we know, or by virtue of St. Gregory, it happened in Europe before St. Gregory, the Pope, the Pope we know, St. Gregory. In this image, the artist has actually placed these two pineapples here. I don't know if you can see this right in there. And those two pineapples are reference to the Americas, so that the artist is making a reference to the resurrection of Christ in the Americas, countering any idea of idolatry in the New World, but now replacing it with essentially this rebirth. The other thing that is really important is that you can see there is a Latin inscription that runs across the top here, on the side, on the bottom, and on the left. So now I'm going to switch so you can see. Here is the very top, says Paulo III Pontifici Maxium. Apologies for my Latin, but it's basically the name of Pope Paul III. Across on the left-hand side here, you can see the word Mexico. So you can see it is in Magna Indarium Urbe Mexico. So in the great city, Indian city of Mexico. Across the bottom, you can see it says Composita Domino Didaco Guberna. And it's making a reference to two governors. It's interesting, or twice making a reference to governing. So composita meaning composed, made up of parts, literally these various different small little pieces, right, of feathers. And then it finishes with gubernatore, cura fratris petriganti minerati 1539. So it's making a reference to Peter Gent, who supervised this work in this area in 1539. The most amazing thing about this is the reason why they're making a reference to the Pope is because this is supposed to be a gift that gets given to him. For what reason? Because he is the person who allowed indigenous people to receive the sacrament. That's what's actually being represented here, right? The moment at which Christ transforms in that host to precisely the body of God. So then you can receive it. By receiving his body, you now are a full Christian with rights. And the indigenous people are wanting to recognize that in this magnificent image as a gift in thanks for giving them that authority to now actually go ahead and be considered as full Christians. Interestingly enough, two different images allow you to understand how this magnificent object could completely be transformed into this splendor, just as birds do. As you can see in this wonderful series of images down here that shows the Ana hummingbird, how the colors essentially in the head change the minute there is any change. And one of the reasons why they did that was precisely because this book, which would sit on essentially on the altar, would be raised. And the minute it would be raised, it would just come on, right? It would be lit literally by your fervor, by your spirit. It's pretty spectacular that the indigenous people were that conscientious, that they knew essentially this materials. And so just to give you yet another example, the various different birds that are created here, just to wrap up, finally coming to the conclusion in relationship to the Splendorous messaging. Here's the illustration that I was mentioning before, that is to say this map, this magnificent map that shows the indigenous city of Mexico, Mexico Tenochtitlan, which you can see here, surrounded by all of these buildings. It's done in a colonial, it's actually presenting the buildings as European buildings. What's interesting is when you look at the center, right, you will see that there is the templum us sacrificant, the place of sacrifice, the temple of sacrifices, and you can see there's a word here that says idol, making a reference to the center being the place where essentially this idolatry was taking place. That is the counter that is actually being done in this magnificent painting, right? In this feather mosaic. They're actually countering this idea that the capital is the place where sacrifices took place to the places where Christ is reborn for the purposes of now rebuilding a new empire. Thing that is most amazing about it, as you can see here, just to end and call your attention, just to the south of the great ceremonial precinct, we have Montezuma's palace, and next to it is you can see here, the Domus Animali, that is to say, the zoo. And you can see these magnificent birds that are presented here, which were part of his larger conglomerate. In addition to, interestingly enough, you can see here, two human beings, one of whom wears balloon pants, similar to those worn by the Spanish. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Eulogio. That was beautiful and fascinating, and I think we all learned a lot. I know we have a whole bunch of questions,
Great.
and so I can just jump right into those. We have about 15 minutes for questions, so anyone
Great.
who has a question, please put those into the Q&A function, and we will get to those. Our first question is about this messaging that you've been talking about.
Right.
And it's specifically about the pre-contact era. So, can you talk more about the function of messaging? And was it
Sure.
religious, civic, memorial? And we also have a question from the same person about the difference between the animal offerings and the physical
Sculptures.
sculptural
Right.
ones.
Yeah. So very, very complicated response, just to tell you that, as you can well imagine, as I mentioned before, every one of these offerings is very different. Though, of course, my colleagues who have been doing all this incredible work, Leonardo Lopez Luján and first initially starting, and of course, in a whole cadre of specialists, he has created this magnificent kind of team of archaeologists, not just in Mexico, but across everywhere. As you can see, everybody is mesmerized by these objects in which they literally engage in trying to understand the multiple kind of layerings, the multiple kinds of messaging. One of the things that is very clear that Leonardo and actually Matos was able to identify early on was the presence of three specific tiers in some cases up to five. Three tiers being making a reference to the layers of the universe, so that therefore these capsules, these offerings, are essentially microcosms of the entire universe, which is where I tap in to say it's not just a religious or a cosmological kind of reference, but it is actually a material reference to the world, which Leonardo has written also, extensively about now, and trying to really look at the various different ways, because they have done such remarkable work that they can actually tell you the kinds of, fur that is actually being worn in some of these sculptures, whether it is female monkey, spider monkey fur, and even that it comes from the chest as opposed to the back, as opposed to, I mean, it's like, it's really quite astounding to really learn the deep layers of meaning. It's all related, I think, precisely to this idea of this vast conglomerate, the idea of emphasizing again and again and again that essentially this is a manifestation of this grand wealth and bounty of empire. So it's both material, literally in terms of the wealth that they're receiving, the tribute that they're receiving, but it's also the spiritual kind of manifestation of their religious kind of principles. That's where you then can begin to understand the various different birds, the various different animals, which have specific, they're making references to specific different territories. And
Mm.
also, what's most remarkable is the way by which some animals are literally just kind of like presented whole, like caimans, alligators, and others, like in the case of one very cute, sort of jaguar, whose whose paws are actually cut out, and part of the body goes into one, and the paws go into a different, offering. It's almost like they, and that's the thing about the what is often referred to as the Montezuma Zoo. Um, uh, you know, it's a misnomer. There were really much more holding pens for the purposes of, when these offerings were being made, that it's like we need to have a reference to a jaguar. And so therefore we only have this one. So the body is going to go into this offering and the paws are going to go over here so that we can symbolically make that reference. But it's also no surprise. The idea of numerology in terms of the four paws making a reference to the four world quarters. It's also, I mean, it's so deeply embedded in this larger kind of meaning. It's a very
Mm.
complicated response, but that's what you're looking at in these objects.
Yeah, it's a complicated situation.
Right.
We have a lot of questions about the birds. Of course,
Right.
our audience is very interested in the birds and the symbolism of the birds, of the use of the feathers, especially with indigenous societies. And are there other cultures that use bird feathers in this way? And what are kind of what's the meaning of using the specific birds for this purpose, the spoonbill and the hummingbird, and obviously for the iridescence, but is there a deeper sort of symbolic meaning?
Yeah, there is. I mean, so and again, really, really a ton of different points of intersection, because they are very precise about using specific birds for certain things, like the roseate spoonbill, making a reference specifically that rosy, that redness is tremendously important for the purposes of making references to blood, to sacrifice, right? And that's one of the reasons why perhaps there is that background on the wolf, because it is a shield after all, and it's a means of going out and essentially using this blood to feed the universe, to continue basically, the world moving. No surprise, there are certain animals, and in the case of the hummingbird, of course, the hummingbird is tremendously important because it is the principal god of the Mexica towards the end of the empire. It's very clear. And I mentioned that the top of the of the temple has these two shrines, and one of them is, dedicated to the god of war, Huitzilopochtli. Huitzilihuit is Nawa for hummingbird. And so, of course, no surprise, has solar associations because, of course, they fly up to the, has also associations with eagles, though, of course, it's a tiny little bird. And one can understand the way in which, when you see the way in which that bird attacks nectar and it's really kind of, darts so quickly, it's understandable that this would be a metaphor for them for the purposes of sort of like domination and warfare. One might not have that association with it today, but certainly if you were to see the way in which one of these tiny little birds quickly kind of does its business and then disappears, right?
Mhm.
And the ways in which they're literally kind of catching on fire also has everything to do with that. So there's a variety of different interpretations. Some colors, some birds have associations with the underworld, as opposed to, the celestial world. And a lot of it often has to do precisely with when they are most active. The Mexica paid a lot of attention to that. They're not the only ones. Question was made about other societies. This is very pervasive across many, many different cultures in Mesoamerica, but also in the Andes. And so, regretfully, of course, as you can understand, fewer items have survived that are older, just simply because, in many cases, the soil conditions or the destruction of these massive kind of settings allow us to understand that, essentially, some of those objects have not survived. This is especially the case with a lot of the Maya material because it is so hot and humid in the areas where the Maya lived. But what we have left is we have these spectacular murals. We have these magnificent carvings. They were, just remarkable in terms of being able to render the kind of costumery, the dress elements, where you see all of these various different bird feathers, that one can only just imagine the iridescence of, what was taking place. One other thing to think about is, especially, it's the reason why I showed you those two images of essentially the Mass of St. Gregory. Oftentimes, many of these devotional images of these saints that are made post-conquest were often rendered, or actually placed, of course, in dark chapels where you have essentially the flickering light of candles. And you can imagine the kind of theatrics that happen. Now, what's really quite remarkable about it is some would be hung quite low, because if you're a devout follower, what you would do is immediately kneel to the image, pray to it. And so when you would look up, that image would then be lit at that angle. And then you'd get up and it would be, off. So your devotion had actually kind of done this material kind of kinetic exchange with it.
Mm.
It's quite spectacular.
Amazing how the materiality can be activated,
That's right.
right? By both your participation and that flickering light.
That's right.
We have many questions. We have, you mentioned Mayan art. We have a
Right.
question about birds seeming particularly prevalent in Mayan art. And, if you can speak about that, were they particularly sacred in Mayan culture?
Um, yes and no. I mean, they were sacred to every culture. I mean, so you have to remember, like, for instance, the iridescent kind of birds that you have. I mean, it's not at all surprising that with the Mexica, you're going to have a ton of tiny little hummingbird feathers, right? Because there are many of them in that area. And they're also so spectacular in their plumage. In the Maya area, no surprise, you're going to have some of the most kind of amazing, kind of iridescent, kind of like, green and green plumage and scarlet macaws. And so it's very, very different there in the sense of it's an entirely different kind of bestiary. And you also see, actually, you can continue to the Andes, where the Andes is the same thing. They're, it's remarkable because many of the cultures in the Andes are making a reference specifically to birds that are in the Amazon forest, right? Which you have still to this day, these remarkable headdresses that are worn by all of these chieftains from the Amazon area. But in the actual, in the Andes, in the high Andes, no surprise, they're going to be coveted for just like a handful or even just a field of just large single feathers that are hanging that would just be worn like this giant sort of camisole that would end up emphasizing the idea of iridescence, the idea of light and, ascendancy. Because of course they were literally bird people, right?
Right. We
They
have a
were as equally,
question.
I'm sorry, I was just going to
Yeah,
say,
go go.
they were as equally fascinated with birds as we are today.
Hmm. We have a question about the raising of birds. Were the feathers for these objects taken from birds in the wild, or were they, like the zoo, these kind of pens, were they raised for the purpose? At-
Absolutely. In addition to the zoo, there was an aviary where precisely they penned all of these animals. Dennis Carr, who was one of the colleague I was working with on this exhibition on these objects, who's now actually at the Huntington, was generous enough to share with me the report from that they had to make on that one spectacular image of Saint Michael that's actually owned by the MFA, and that has they had to count every single one of those little feathers. And, it's remarkable, the amount of hummingbird feathers that he said, could be harvested from just one single hummingbird, close to 1,000. And so it's like that. At first you just think like, oh my goodness, it's like how many birds died for this? But the reality of it is, it's, yes, many did. They harvested them. And, this was something that, one can't just imagine. And this is perhaps the most magnificent bird for the Maya was the quetzal. And it was also the same for the Mexica. It's one of the reasons why that very famous headdress, which is also at the Welt Museum in Vienna, which is referred to as Montezuma's headdress. It's just this iridescent, high, just giant. It's all of these tales of this quetzal, which of course it's in that case we may have. I mean, I don't know what the number is, but certainly close to 100 birds that ended up giving its tails for the purposes of the spectacular headdress that would be worn.
Yeah. We only have a couple of minutes left. I'm going to ask this question, which may hopefully not take too much time, but we've had a lot of news lately about objects being returned to
Right,
their countries of origin.
right,
Are any of these objects, to your knowledge, are they, how they were acquired?
right.
Are any of these pieces subject to return and
Yeah, yeah,
repatriation?
yeah. And in fact, there has been a lot of requests being made about these many different objects, which, like I said, when I presented this, it's really difficult to actually know with any precision as to whether it is the specific object that actually was given. And part of it is because, of course, many of these objects were handed, over time. The one standard that had a little butterfly on it that is just so cute. We actually do know very well that that was an object that was given by Charles V to his brother, Ferdinand II. And it is an amazing object in that it is the object that leads him to basically create. He asks his valet to create a room for his objects. It's the first Kunstkammer, the first reference to a Kunstkammer that gets made in 1536. It is the birth of sort of like these museum collections. It's what is leading down this path. And that is an object that at least we know was there that early. But whether it is of that first initial exchange, which is the only one exchange at this moment, I mean, I'd like to, I'm doing work on this, that initial gift that Montezuma gives, which supposedly had over 100 objects, you have to remember, Cortez is writing this from the perspective of someone who's seeing this for the first time. And so his descriptions are okay, but he's not a museum registrar. And so therefore, the problem that we get ourselves into today is that there's a lot of debate amongst, all of us experts about as to whether it is that this is that specific object. And it can't be because Cortez makes a reference that there's a tassel. It's like, well, the tassel could have been removed. It's like we're talking now, these objects get passed from place to place. But by and large, regretfully, sadly, yes, the majority of these objects are extracted in war, in various different kinds of different major exchanges. However, there's also that other component. We have to be careful that we don't lump everything together under one single act. Because the reality is, again, what I'm trying to emphasize here is that Montezuma made that decision. It's very clear. He sent all of these objects. He had them ready. That is to say, so you just think about this. To make any of those objects would have taken months. He had his artist immediately begin the production of these objects. And if you just even think, he is in the Central Valley of Mexico. It takes roughly around 5 days to a week. Cortez was not hanging out trying to figure out where he was going to land for that long. So they were at the ready. They had all of these objects. So it's very clear in that this is a political gift that's being given. So it's not that I'm against returning it. By all means, I think it should be. But we also undermine the larger political negotiations and the actual agency of indigenous people, that they were doing something that they thought would benefit them. Huge miscalculation. But nevertheless, I still think it's pretty impressive that they were thinking that far ahead. They were playing, unfortunately, three-dimensional chess, and they lost.
Right.
So it's
Thank
not
you
that I
so
don't
much.
think they shouldn't be returned.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. It's part of a more complicated and very, very purposeful story.
Right.
Thank you so much,
Of course.
Professor
Absolutely.
Guzmán. What a fascinating and beautifully illustrated talk. This talk has been recorded, and you can access that on our website. You'll also get a follow-up email with a link to the recording. So you can share it. You can watch it again. You can share it with friends and family. And we hope that you'll join us for our next lecture, which takes place on November 19th. And will feature artist and activist Rebecca McGee-Tuck, who'll talk about her incredible art that she creates from beach refuse, and how art has played an important role in her efforts to raise awareness around conservation issues. Thank you so, so much for joining us, Eulogio. Thank you for an amazing talk. I know everyone enjoyed it. We still have some questions I'm sorry we didn't get to, but you'll feel free to email us, and we'll send them along to Eulogio. Thank you so much for your knowledge and for sharing your research with us. We're so grateful.
Absolutely. And I'm so grateful for everybody who decided to spend an hour with us tonight.
Yes,
Great.
thank you all, and please join us for our other lectures. And with that, I'll say good night. Thank you so much.
Great.